Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Laurie Beeman. Welcome to Critical Thinkers in Religion, Law, and Social Theory. We are running just a tiny bit late, but we usually wait for people to arrive, but the room is full, so we might have to camp out on the floor if anyone else arrives. I want to thank my co-organizers, André de Liberté, Pascal Fournier, Elke Winter, and Sonia Sika. André and Sonia are here. The series is normally mostly funded by the Canada Research Chair in Contextualization of Religion in a Diverse Canada, which is a research chair that I hold. But I'm really happy to say that this particular talk has been co-sponsored by the Centre for International Policy Studies. So I'd like to thank everyone there who's been so incredibly helpful in not only financially supporting Beth's talk, but also in promoting the talk and giving some public space through blog conversations and so on. So the Centre has been phenomenal in that regard. So thank you, and I don't actually know who you are, so thank you. Thank you very, very much. And then also thank you to Stephen Tomlins, who's on the video camera, Marianne Aboud Hamad, who is somewhere, no, she's not here, but she helped us set everything up. Karen Henri, who I think also is not here, and she too was involved in the organization of this. And last but not least, Heather Shipley, who's the project manager for the Religion and Diversity Project, that's sort of also involved in setting this series up. So without further ado, and I'll be relatively brief in my introduction as I always am, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Elizabeth Shakman Hurd from Northwestern University. Her title talk is Believing in Religious Freedom, and she's an associate professor of political science at Northwestern University. And I've just come from teaching my graduate class where the students were actually reading her book, The Politics of Secularism in International Relations, which was published by Princeton in 2008. And they were extremely engaged, as was I. I've read through the book several times, and some of Beth's ideas in that book, I think we'll hear some of those transported into the talk today on religious freedom. She's also the co-organizer of the Politics of Religious Freedom, Contested Norms, and Local Practices, which is a 3-year study of legal and political contestation surrounding religious freedom and the rights of religious minorities in South and Southeast Asia, the US, the Middle East, the European Union, and that's funded by the Luce Foundation. So her reach is quite broad, as you can see, global in scope. Without further ado, I'd invite you to help me to welcome Elizabeth Shakman Hurd.
Thanks everyone. Can you hear me in the back? Yes. Yes, good. If you stop being able to hear me for some reason, please let me know. And if I'm going too fast, please take something from that reception table and throw it at me, because I have a tendency to talk fast. So it's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for hosting me. It's such a wonderful opportunity. I've never given a talk in Canada before. So my husband's from Ottawa, and he was joking with me I needed to brush up on my Canadian. So we'll see how I do. But it's really, truly a pleasure to be here. So thank you all for coming. Thanks so much. Okay, so in the U.S., let me see if I want to now. We'll wait on that. In the U.S., religious freedom is described as the first freedom. It is understood to be a fundamental human right, a sine qua non of modern democratic politics, if not of civilization itself. People don't joke about religious freedom. We are told, Americans, that we invented it and we perfected it. And now it's ready for export. And exporting it, we most certainly are. A rapidly escalating number of actors are promoting religious freedom across state borders today. There is enormous excitement about the potential of formalizing and bureaucratizing religious freedom promotion. Legal guarantees of religious freedom are embedded as riders in trade agreements, in aid and assistance packages, and in humanitarian projects all over the world. The EU is promoting religious freedom in its external affairs programming, adding clauses to trade agreements with North African and Central Asian trading partners that will guarantee these partners' commitment to religious freedom. In Brussels, initiatives to train EU diplomats in religious freedom promotion are in the works, and the EU, as we speak, is drafting official guidelines on the subject. I'm heading over there next month to discuss this with them. At the UN, the Human Rights Office is in its third decade of promoting religious freedom and has recently initiated a campaign to combat incitement to religious hatred. This office is led by the Special Rapporteur on Religion of Freedom or Belief, appointed by the UN Human Rights Council. It focuses on ensuring state compliance with international human rights norms and standards developed roughly over the past 60 years. I won't list them all. Last but not least, foreign policy establishments are gearing up to promote religious freedom. The most recent example is, of course, Canada, where your Prime Minister Harper announced in spring 2011 that his government will be creating an Office of Religious Freedom at the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, which I think goes by DFAIT, right? Okay. And this office is to be explicitly modeled on the American office in the State Department, which has been promoting religious freedom abroad for 14 years. And here are some of the hot spots. So, the promotion of religious freedom is ubiquitous. It is not only evangelicals. An impressive array of institutions and public authorities across the political spectrum, secular and religious, has taken up this cause. Religious freedom is becoming a language used to garner international political legitimacy. The right to religious freedom is becoming what Laila Abu-Lughod calls a dialect of universality. Religious freedom, one could say, is being disseminated through international institutions and practices so that it is to some extent everywhere, translated, resisted, vernacularized, invoked in political struggles, made the standard language enforced by power. This is how I became interested in it. Like human rights, religious freedom has captured the field of emancipatory possibility. It is the answer to every question today. It stands in for the good and the right in many difficult and often violent situations. So in all of this excitement surrounding religious freedom as a universal norm, who on earth could be against religious freedom? It's easy to forget that these projects undertaken in the name of religious freedom are indeed political projects. They are indeed situated in history. They are implemented by particular powerful state and international authorities. It's very easy to be swept away in the common collective sense that if we guarantee religious freedom, we will be safe. We will be safe from pre-modern political orders based on tyrannical forms of religious authority that leave women and minorities in the dust. Who would want that? When religious freedom is positioned as it is as the alternative to these extremely unappealing options, it is not all that surprising that religious freedom and the projects that operate in its name have gathered this extraordinary momentum. So today I'm going to step back from the excitement and the anxiety surrounding the promotion of religious freedom. I am going to suggest that the promotion of religious freedom is not simply about spreading a beneficent, universal norm and legal standard. Instead, what we have here is a site of politics, and we have a site indeed of religious politics that we need to think very carefully about and consider. Specifically, I will suggest that religious freedom advocacy and religious freedom more broadly as a way of organizing how we see the world as a discursive frame, that this advocacy actively politicizes religious difference, that it often masks complex political realities on the ground, that it often obscures diverse and multi-form religious realities as they are actually lived and experienced. So the insistence on legalizing and the top-down promotion of religious freedom brings into being a world, a particular kind of world. It helps to create a world in which religious difference becomes a little bit more salient politically rather than less. It helps to draw some lines between communities, horizontally and hierarchically. Not that the lines were non-existent before, but it nudges in a certain direction, defines and shapes what it means to be religious, what it means to be free. And in the process, religious freedom shapes and constrains political realities and religious possibilities on the ground. And this is what brings me to working at the intersection of politics and religious studies as I do. This leads us to a question, a very paradoxical question. does religious freedom promotion actually promote religious freedom? I'll begin with the conflict in Syria. What kind of political and religious world does religious freedom promotion create in Syria? In other words, what do we see when we view the war in Syria through the lens of religious freedom? How does this framing then affect that conflict itself? So I'm going to talk about that first. Then second and finally, I'm going to ask, given these complicated considerations, is a world created by religious freedom a place in which we want to live? If it's not, is there any alternative? So first, Syria. We good in the back? All right. Calls for the protection of persecuted Christians in Syria, and in fact all around the Middle East in the wake of the so-called Arab so-called Spring, have been a cornerstone of religious freedom advocacy, particularly in U.S. foreign policy circles, but not exclusively. There are very serious concerns here, and we need to look carefully and pay close attention to the plight of minorities in the region. What I want to do is look more closely at how the problem has been framed and the specific consequences of framing the crisis in Syria in terms of religious freedom. And I will ask you to consider a paradoxical possibility, which is that framing the problem and now the war in Syria as a crisis of religious freedom may create the very problems that religious freedom purports to solve. This is a complicated story. So a couple of background examples. Christian Solidarity International, Joe Eibner at CSI has lobbied President Obama to urge Ban Ki-moon to declare a genocide warning for Christians across the Middle East. There's been enormous talk in Washington around this issue. Howard Berman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee says that the future of minorities is, quote, on our agenda as we figure out how to help these countries, end quote, and their treatment of Christians and other minorities is a, quote, red line that will affect future aid. Habib Malik of Lebanese American University has called for Western nations to stand up for the rights of Christians, who, he says, may be cleansed from lands where democratic elections are used to oppress minorities rather than to empower them. Malik says that this must be done in a way that's not misperceived on the other end, but, he concludes, the West must not be cowed. USA Today has reported that according to Christian rights groups, Christians in Syria, where Muslims have risen up against President Assad, have been subjected to murder, rape, and kidnappings in Damascus and rebellious towns. So the momentum builds, and the apparent logic of the story is clear. As USA Today reported, when Muslims rise up against Assad, in other words, when the Muslim majority populations of the Middle East are left to their own devices and are no longer held in check and repressed by the secular autocrats that we have supported for decades, the result is Christian persecution. That is the logic of the story. But of course, the problem here is that the Syrian protests, like other protests in the region, are simply not captured by the notion, by the sentence, Muslims rising up against Assad. This is how the regime wants us to hear the story. This is indeed the regime's story, and it has been for decades. For decades, as you know, the Assads, both of them, have relied on the threat of sectarian anarchy that is lurking just below the surface, ready to explode, to justify and maintain their autocratic rule in Syria. When the media, when government officials, when public figures all reinforce this framing, the regime's framing of the war, as a sectarian conflict pitting Sunnis against Alawites and their Shiite allies, it makes sectarian violence more rather than less likely. It energizes divides between Christian, Alawite, and Sunni. It brings these identities to the surface, puts them at the top of people's list, accentuates them and aggravates them. We saw similar dynamics in Bosnia in the 1990s, been written about by David Campbell. So when religious difference, in other words, becomes the primary lens through which complex social, political, economic, and religious conflicts, when it becomes the primary frame for understanding these conflicts, I'm arguing that sectarian conflict is exacerbated. This approach fortifies categories of difference, Christian, Alawite, Sunni, that might not otherwise necessarily define what indeed did begin as a popular uprising against a secular autocrat. Their sign reads, "The Syrian people are being slaughtered, O Arabs." So many Syrians, like people everywhere, hold multiple allegiances, celebrate diverse traditions, are frequently of mixed backgrounds, may not fit cleanly and neatly into the rubrics of religious identity, into the religious identitarianism, if you want to call it that, demanded by religious freedom advocates. Left out in the cold, these people, these kind of in-betweens, find themselves in an impossible and vexed position of having to make political claims on religious grounds, I'm this or I'm that, or simply having no grounds from which to speak. Dissenters, doubters, families that may have multiple religious affiliations under the same roof, become pressured, may even feel compelled to choose a side. This is the logic of sectarianism. They are required to respond to an imperative to define their identity in religious terms. Are you this or are you that? Tell me, what are you? This is what I mean when I say that religious freedom has the potential to activate, to energize, and indeed to politicize religious difference. I'm not saying it always does, and I'm going to go into some more detail here. But I am suggesting that in this framing of this conflict, I'm getting interference. Is there volume on here? No. All right, maybe that did it. In this framing, then, religious freedom promotion paradoxically may add fuel to the fire of the very sectarian conflict that religious freedom claims to be uniquely equipped to transcend. A bizarre paradox. So to suggest that this conflict stems from a failure to acknowledge the rights of certain believers conceals the ways in which social divisions cut across sectarian divides in Syria. There's great work on this, actually. It obscures the ways forward when the focus is not on beliefs or communities of believers, but rather on shared human needs, on human dignity, on visions, on accountability and transparency and fair governance, the real issues in this conflict. To be clear, now let me just explain. The mobilization of the logic of sectarianism for political ends extends far beyond Syria. It extends far beyond the language of religious freedom. For example, this logic has come to dominate media coverage of the uprising in Bahrain that is ongoing right now. Here in Bahrain, an embattled regime, challenged by both Shia and Sunni dissenters, has largely succeeded in framing the conflict as sectarian, mobilizing Sunni against Shia on the claim that the Shia are controlled by a predatory Iran, as Joost Hilterman has argued in the New York Review of Books. Hilterman says, by whipping up sectarian sentiments, the Bahraini government hopes to change the perception of the conflict from one that pits a popular pro-democracy movement against an authoritarian regime, just like Syria, to one of a sectarian struggle between Sunni and Shia, with a strong government needed to step in and maintain order. What I am suggesting is that religious freedom taps into and feeds into this logic, but it does not generate it by itself. It's a complex field. It feeds into a broader complex. So what I am suggesting is that in Syria, in Bahrain, and elsewhere, the complex histories, the experiences, and the uncertainties that shape religious identification in the contemporary world simply cannot be squeezed into the rigid categories imposed by top-down religious freedom promotion. They just don't fit. They don't do justice to people's lives, to their lived experiences, to their lived religion, and non-religion, for that matter. Recent scholarship in the study of religion is helpful in helping me to develop this point. As Noah Solomon and Jeremy Walton argued very recently in a book, the Cambridge book edited by Bob Orsi, my colleague at Northwestern, what makes someone a believer or a member of a faith community, and what makes someone not so? What life experiences, confessional commitments, and ritual practices qualify one as an insider, and which prohibit someone from inclusion? Are insider and outsider categories that we must inhabit permanently, or can we move between them? Most importantly, should scholars or governments or international organizations attempt to adjudicate these questions of religious identity and belonging, thereby becoming arbiters of orthodoxy. So in this passage, Solomon and Walton are alluding to the complexities of religious affiliation and practice. This is old news for all of these great religious studies scholars I know sitting here in front of me. They acknowledge the difficulties of assigning individuals to the category of believer or non-believer, the movement, the flux, the parts that don't fit. They allude to the structures of power, what they call the arbiters of orthodoxy, that are implicated in deciding who's in, who's not in at any given moment. By and large, I'm saying that contemporary international religious freedom advocacy by states and other large, powerful authorities works in the opposite direction. Rather than, as Solomon and Walton do, questioning the power of established authorities to make these designations, rather than interrogating the ability or the willingness of individuals to live by them, these projects strengthen lines of difference, funnel people into one community or another, authorize and politicize boundaries that might not otherwise have as much political traction. To borrow a phrase from a new book by Hussein Agrama, religious freedom turns religion into an object of politics. Is this a world we want to live in? Is there an alternative? So now I'm going to talk, the last section I'm going to talk about is going to go a little bit more social theoretical, since the title of the lecture series is Critical Thinking and Social Theory, so bear with me. But we'll start out a little bit lighter. So what I've suggested is that the story of international religious freedom is kind of like a good movie. It offers something for everyone, right? It's a battle between cowardly oppressors and the undaunted and heroic saviors of the downtrodden. Who wouldn't want to see that movie? It's a story of the triumph of international law and the policing of those who fail to adhere to global norms and standards. A more boring movie for sure, but nonetheless something that certain people in international relations would definitely line up for. It's a story of the secular tolerance of plural beliefs as a remedy for those backward religious beliefs that would otherwise generate violence. So it's a story of taming religion, an old story, a very old story. And today especially, it's also a story of the need for the US government and others, increasingly, to convince people in other countries, particularly but not only Muslims, that they should endorse a model, the model, as it turns out, of religious liberty, as a template for organizing and democratizing themselves, their polities, and their societies. So as you've probably gathered, my story is more complex and less self-congratulatory. I've suggested these initiatives draw lines that divide religion from non-religion, which is then often marked as culture, often differentiate believer from non-believer, and mark off one religious community from another. They also help to create individual subjects in what are called faith communities. We're always talking about faith communities, for whom choosing and believing in religion are seen as the defining characteristics of what it is to be a modern subject, and the right to choose to believe or not as the essence of what it means to be free. To achieve this unity then in freedom of belief, this belief in belief across these various communities of belief, is what it means to have achieved religious freedom. So, by empowering religious authorities at the expense of dissenters, doubters, and those on the margins, as my colleague Winnie Sullivan has argued, religious freedom may also undermine democracy abroad. And this is not because democracy is necessarily secular, but rather because the forms of religion, the hierarchical institutionalized forms of religion that are defended by the American bishops, the US State Department, Open Doors, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Christian Solidarity International, and now perhaps DFATE, heavily regulates, may even shut down on occasion, the very spaces in which non-established, diverse, and democratic forms of religion may actually have a chance to flourish. So if we can say that the problem, we might agree that the problem that religious freedom is designed to solve is to find ways somehow to live together across deep, multidimensional social, political, religious diversity and difference. If that is the case, I'm suggesting that this may be something that necessarily has to occur if it is to mean anything outside of those spaces that are enacted through legal regulation by large public and private authorities, whether religious or secular. You can call them what you like. Religious freedom then needs to be reimagined. We need to think differently. We need to think of it as a site of resistance against these authorities, rather than a form of discipline imposed by them that funnels people into predefined religious boxes and then politicizes their differences. We could call this an agonistic model of freedom. To move in that direction, I adapt a notion of freedom articulated by Foucault. I'm not going to cite Foucault, I'm not going to go into that in a talk, but I'm going to say, just to cite William Connolly, in this image, William Connolly explains freedom is not reducible to the freedom of subjects. It is at least partly the release of that which doesn't fit into the molds of subjectivity and normalization. So what this means is it leads us to a different conception of rights. And this is broader than just religious rights, but rights in general. So rights are attached not to the self as a subject, but to that which is defined by the normalized subject as otherness, as deviating from, as falling below, or failing to live up to the standard of subjectivity. Freedom more broadly then emerges here as a site of resistance, as a constant moving mode of insurrection against attempts to institutionalize and normalize subjects. It's not a mode of discipline, whether religious or political. It's not something that's imposed by authorities on subjects who are known only by their deficits in rights. It is instead attached precisely to that which the authorities define as otherness, as unorthodox, as dissenting, as minority, as minoritarian. Social theory offers a lot of resources to elaborate this alternative. An agonistic approach to rights resonates with William James' concept of anarchical or willful individuality. In political theorist Alexander Livingston's reading of William James, freedom is located in the arc of critically negotiating norms imposed by the authorities. Wary of the rigidities imposed by large modern institutions, suspicious of a tendency to fix and stabilize difference in the name of unity, James endeavored to ease the grip of what he called monism on our thinking, to counter this pervasive tendency in modernity to attempt to reconcile all difference into one, into unity. And I think James's politics, which I won't go into more here, are helpful as we start to consider and think about religious freedom. He allows us to see that the object here is not to overcome or overturn or throw out religious freedom. No, it is to engage the presumptive dimensions of the politics that accompany these projects, each separate project that is undertaken in the name of religious freedom. What are the presumptive dimensions? For example, I've suggested that top-down religious freedom advocacy by states often attempts to define and corral religious difference. In the process of trying to manage and straighten things out and keep it neat and tidy and oversee it, it actually politicizes it. James's suspicion of large institutions and modern forms of power is echoed by Talal Assad. And Assad observes that the modern idea of religious belief, protected as an individual right, is a function of the secular state, but not of democratic sensibility. In its strongest forms, then, the promotion of international religious freedom globalizes the secular state's power over the individual. Appearing as a guarantee of the worth of the individual's own desires, as it is aptly marketed, it's actually a story of telling people who they are, how to be, and what to do. It privileges certain ways of doing, not intentionally, inadvertently, and privileges certain ways of being as deserving special protection by the state or associations thereof. It singles out authorized representatives of believers, and less frequently non-believers as well, for legal protection, reinforcing divisions and hierarchies within and between communities. In its most insistent moments, it's a story of the cost in human dignity and diversity that is associated with the attempt to make, as Don Lopez argued, belief the measure of what religion is understood to be, and the freedom to believe the measure of what it means to be free. So the kind of approach that I'm advocating, that I'm thinking through here with regard to religious freedom, is an attempt to shake up this attempt, to destabilize it, The idea is to allow new identities to come up from beneath the threshold of public recognition, such as those seeking legal and political protections that are already enjoyed by others. Here we might think of campaigns by the Baha'i citizens of Egypt for civic and political recognition. We may consider attempts by Native Americans and First Nations peoples to gain recognition for their practices and traditions. Or in a slightly different mode, and notice I'm not only taught, this is not just religious, right? These are not only articulated in religious terms. In a slightly different mode, we might consider the recent campaign by the U.S. Leadership Conference of Women Religious in the U.S., representing approximately 80% of Catholic nuns in the United States. As many of you probably know, the women religious have taken a stand in the face of disciplinary action by the Vatican, which was detailed in the recent doctrinal assessment of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. And as I probably should have mentioned at the beginning, I've recently co-edited with Winnie Sullivan a series of posts on the academic blog, The Imminent Frame, in which we consider a lot of these issues. So if anyone is interested in that, I'm happy to send you the link. One of those pieces was written by Elizabeth Castelli, and I'm drawing on it here. And in Elizabeth Castelli's description of the Vatican's assessment, she says, religious freedom emerges as nothing more than a mode of shoring up the authority of the magisterium of bishops, not a set of values that shelters and protects the acts of conscience undertaken by Catholic women religious in the U.S., end quote. So, I have learned that to question, to even think critically and carefully and historically about religious freedom makes you vulnerable to accusations of defiling something sacred. There is a sense of certainty of having found the answer in the way that experts and different public authorities talk about religious freedom today. There is a sense of excitement, of team spirit, join the club, and purposefulness that inhabits and characterizes these movements. There's also a sense of existential trust, of having expunged a sense of foreignness from existence and found a place to settle in committing to religious freedom for one and all. It's a comforting notion. The approach that I am proposing, or that I'm drawing your attention to here, doesn't share this sense of certainty, surety, or stability. Religious freedom isn't something that can be defined and promoted by a state, a church, an international organization, or any other centralized authority or institution. Instead, we can talk about different modes and modalities of freedom that emerge as sites of resistance to attempts to arbitrate religious orthodoxy and to fix standards of inclusion and exclusion. Like William James's transnational anti-war and anti-imperial politics, this mode of political action and activity links multiple sites and multiple jurisdictions into a network of struggles and actions. These local energies don't come together into a unique, coherent, unitary package that we can set on the table and say, isn't it beautiful, religious freedom? There is no single politics here. There is no prescriptive program that we can go around and tell everyone to live by. Rather, there is what Livingston, inspired by Gilles Deleuze, describes as a nomadic anti-authoritarianism, an agonistic engagement with power that's always situated in local micropolitics, as in the Syrian case. There isn't a larger unity that gathers up all lived experience into a neat and tidy whole. There is no consensus waiting to be settled on. If only the obstinate would back down and come around, if only we would just play by the rules as we are told. So, who's the subject of religious freedom? This approach to thinking through and about religious freedom relies on a notion of a religious subject that is conditioned but not determined by legal, religious, and discursive structures. I think this is important to point out. This is a subject that is an individual, a person, that is never fully constituted or fully captured by orthodoxy of any kind. Instead, I'm adapting Sullivan's approach to religious lives as eclectic, as adaptive, as acculturating, meaning that they mix not only with other religious traditions around them, but also with practices from the broader cultures that surround them. What this means, of course, is that there is no such thing as authentic religion or authentic secularism. This is a messy, complex field. It also means that religious freedom is not something that we can simply impose, define and impose in some legal normative standard. So if religious freedom isn't something that can be promoted in this way, then what on earth are all of these authorities promoting? Everyone is for it. In whose name do they actually speak? Are those empowered by the spread of religious freedom capable of assessing and then judging the lives of all of those that they seek to redeem? Well, clearly I have my doubts about that. And looking ahead, I think that we need to consider carefully a few questions before moving forward too excitedly in our promotion of religious freedom. I think first we need to acknowledge the gap between the complexities of people's actual lives and the stories told by those who are attributing all social ills to a lack of religious freedom. We need to ask, relatedly, what complex political realities are masked by an all-consuming attention to religious freedom. We might also consider experimenting with a different modality of freedom, as I've tried to outline in a very abbreviated way today. A different modality of freedom as a site of resistance against powerful institutionalized authorities that are trying to standardize and normalize, rather than as a form of religious and political discipline imposed by them. So we might consider responding in Canada and elsewhere to the seemingly unstoppable onslaught of religious freedom advocacy in the name of alternate ways of being religious, alternate ways of being human, ways that are now being sidelined, I'm afraid, ironically, by a singular focus to secure religious freedom. Thank you. Let me just point out one thing on this last slide. The cards that I sent around, I'm afraid there may not have been enough for all of you, but the cards are simply a brief description, a couple of sentences describing a collaborative research project that I'm a part of, that Lori was kind enough to mention, and the title is here, Politics of Religious Freedom, Contested Norms and Local Practices. So this is one very small part of a much, much bigger project in which we try to address, I can't say we answer, but we try to address many of the questions that I raised today and a lot of others that I didn't raise and that I'm not equipped to study, and that's why we're working with quite a number of different people who are helping us to think through these questions in a global, comparative, and historical context. So I would encourage anyone who's interested to visit the website and also to have a look at the Imminent Frame series of essays, and finally also to be in touch. We welcome any further inquiries.